Okay, welcome to our final session for the pre-conference day. We have Associate Professor Philip McIntyre from the University of Newcastle. Philip is a communication and media scholar with a research focus on creativity and innovation. He's the group leader of the University of Newcastle's Communication and Media Research Group and a member of the Hunter Centre for Creative Industries and Technology. Philip has also had over 25 years of industrial and professional experience in the music industry, where he was a songwriter, instrumentalist, musical director and manager for various musical groups dealing with promoters, record companies and distribution labels. And this afternoon he's going to talk to us about what is the Fifth Estate and why does it matter. So thank you, Philip.
I was also in an extended way a member of the Fourth Estate, which I just flashed into my head. I got to interview David Bowie at one point as a music journalist, which I did for about eight or so years. So I don't know why I mentioned that, because it just popped into my head as you were going through that whole process. What I want to do this afternoon is, I guess, a couple of things. I want to link what we're doing here with what's happening in the next 3 days with the ANZCA conference itself. Its theme is creating space in the Fifth Estate, which, as Kate mentioned, I'm a songwriter, so primarily that theme was there because it scanned really well and it a number of internal rhymes and so on. That's probably not the best reason to be doing it. My work is in creativity and innovation. I'm really interested in how that process happens. And I've written a fair bit about it. Here's a couple of the more recent books, etc. The one on the right being co-written with Elizabeth Payton, who was here on the panel earlier, and Janet Fulton, who I saw somewhere earlier. Maybe she's ducked out again. Primarily what I've been doing since '94 is looking at creativity and innovation as a systemic process, as opposed to a romantic view of things. My latest research effort is a linkage grant with a couple of industry partners here in Newcastle, looking at the creative and cultural production in the Hunter region, an applied ethnographic study of new entrepreneurial systems in the creative industries. And this is kind of where my talk today is really focused. Because we're dealing with this, and most of the new businesses that we're looking at are centred in the digital world, that's made me think about the context in which they occur, the social, technological, environmental, political, legal, ethical context and so on. So that then led, of course, to this, the idea of the Fifth Estate. This is a web page from the National Film and Sound Archive, which is where I first came across the concept itself. And I think it's really succinct in the way it describes things. The thinkers of the 18th and 19th centuries had understood the importance of the press to society and had named it the Fourth Estate, after the other three estates, the nobility, the clergy and the middle class. Little did they know that the 21st century would see the emergence of an equally important Fifth Estate, and they just describe it here as the internet and the World Wide Web. And that, of course, sent me on a much larger search. And I came across this guy from Oxford, William Dutton, and particular things that he'd been doing. He kind of adds to this, and some of this may be quite well known to you at this point, but the three estates, certainly in the maybe last 120, 150 years, have been mutated out of that French and English idea into the legislative, the executive and judicial branches of government themselves. And added to that, of course, is the press themselves, the 20th century media, mainstream media that we know as television, radio, print and so on. What I also came across in this search was this particular webcast from William Dutton, who is a professor in the Oxford Internet Institute. And if you want to come to grips with the notion of the Fifth Estate, it's about a 40-minute webcast. It's really quite worthwhile looking at. I might just explain quickly about these PowerPoints and my approach to them. I might give them to the conference organisers so that you can go and read through them for yourself. Some of them will contain just pictures, some of them will contain lots of text and pictures, some just text. And I've tried where the text is to bold what I consider to be the important points. So you can just make your own way in an interactive way through this narrative by just listening to my voice. You can close your eyes and do that if you want to. You can just look at the pretty pictures, you can just read the bold material, or you can attempt to go through the entire text itself, some of which I will do, some of it I won't. So it's a journey for me as well, these particular PowerPoints. So what does William Dutton, who's probably the most significant figure in this area, saying about the fifth estate? And this is where I will come to read some of this. He's saying, in the 21st century, a new institution is emerging with some characteristics similar to the fourth estate. We've certainly been talking about it here, but with sufficiently distinctive and important features to warrant its recognition as a new fifth estate. This is being built on the growing use of the internet and related information and communication technologies in ways that are enabling networked individuals to reconfigure access to alternative sources of information, people and other resources. Such network of networks enables the networked individual to move across, undermine and go beyond the boundaries of existing institutions, thereby opening new ways of increasing the accountability of politicians, press experts and other loci of power and influence in much the same way as the fourth estate has been doing across the 20th century. These are neither personal nor institutional networks, but networked individuals, according to Dutton. And this reflects many attributes of Manuel Castell's conception of a network society, which as a systems thinker I have quite a deep interest in, and which are similar to what have been called internet-enabled networks. So I think that's a relatively, I won't say succinct because it's not, relatively good description of what the fifth estate is about. And we are all part of it in one way or another. Facebook, right there, a very good example of a network at work across the globe itself. The cloud, that's probably another network way to look at this process as well. But deeply connected to, and I don't want to go too far into digitisation because it's been looked at quite significantly, as Jonathan was talking about here a little bit earlier. But what I try to point out to my students is that that abstract concept is deeply connected to a very real, not virtual, but a very real geography in a real landscape associated with particular access to power generation, particular access to water and so on. So in other words, it's deeply, deeply connected in a systemic way, up and down and sideways as well. Take the cloud away, as has happened with these satellite images, and this is what the globe actually looks like. A whole series, thousands and thousands of satellite images without cloud on those particular days when they were taken. So where are we in relation to that particular world? This is out of a recent article in Communication Research and Practice, a journal just started by Terry Flew, saying that often communication scholars tend to identify globalisation as a recent phenomenon, something that happened a few decades ago. Indeed, the 1990s, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, goes through and looks at the whole processes that you would be used to in terms of the growing transnational corporations, the ICTs and so on, the internet itself, the emergence of global health, environmental issues and so on. But this is a really interesting point to me. Globalisation is not a product of the 1990s or even the 20th century. In fact, historians are arguing that it goes back much further than that. So it's neither a wholly novel nor primarily modern social phenomenon. Its form has changed over time and across the key domains of human interaction, from the political to the ecological. Before I pursue this just a little bit further, I do want to relate this to the topics that you've been talking about today, because I think there are underlying sets of ideas, there are underlying processes at work, apart from you getting to understanding how casualisation and the peripherate have come into existence, that account for them in some way. Some historians will take you back to the Mongol Empire in particular, and Genghis Khan, and those empires as the early forms of globalisation. We could travel forward in history and have a look at what happened with the British Empire as a form of globalisation as well, some of which we are still living with in terms of the implications and repercussions of that particular empire. And here's another one at work right now, occupying this part of the globe. And you can see the brand names and so on at work here. And this is what we tend to think of as globalisation. But it has a long and deep history to it. As part of that connected network process, I came across this article maybe about 6 months ago from Der Spiegel, German newspaper, which is of course now online with an international edition. And it really got me thinking, and this is for me where this whole series of ideas connects up with what you're doing as well. This article was called Tomorrowland, How Silicon Valley Shapes Our Future. And I don't think we can deny that things are changing, and I think really what you've been talking about today is a manifestation of those changes. And they're changing very fast. And Schultz had this to say: the technological advances made in the last decade have been breathtaking, but it is likely still just the beginning. We're witnessing nothing less than a societal transformation that ultimately nobody will be able to avoid. It's the kind of sea change that can only be compared with 19th century industrialisation, but it's happening much faster this time. Just as the change from handwork to mass production dramatically changed our society over 100 years ago, the digital revolution isn't just altering specific sectors of the economy, as it is with the education sector and many others. It's changing the way we think and the way that we live. I don't know whether you got the chance to watch Four Corners last night. Did anyone watch Four Corners last night? You would have got, and thanks to Ed that I got onto this, you would have then had a fairly close look at particularly at automation. But the thing that struck me about this particular program, and it's summarised here in this paragraph at the bottom of this web page from the ABC, there are startling and credible predictions that more than 5 million Australian jobs will simply disappear in the next 15 years as a result of technology. And that's 40% of the jobs that exist in Australia today, which has a direct effect on what you're doing. And here's one of those fairly credible reports from Deloitte. And it's their digital disruption map. And across this graph we have time in years, and over here we have the level of impact of those changes. And they've taken each one of those industries and allocated them to a particular sector. Some things are happening fast, some things are happening very rapidly and quite dramatically. Some things are on a far longer fuse and maybe not happening as dramatically, but it's happening across all of them. We would know, just from our own work in media and communication, that the media industries, the arts and recreation industries and so on are being heavily affected by what's occurring with what Deloitte is calling digital disruption. Retail, we know that's happening as well. Has anyone here been to a Video Easy lately? Anyone else got Netflix like myself? So on. But I think what's also interesting is that you have these other industries: health, agriculture, manufacturing, even mining being affected by what's occurring with the digital, and this one up here, education. You've only got to look at things like alt school coming out of Silicon Valley and so on to understand that there are massive changes underway right now. So those findings are quite dramatic, with 65% of the nation's economy and 13 of the 18 industries either experiencing or very soon to experience a big bang disruption of some sort. There's one example right there, the relationship between Uber and what's occurring with the taxis in the world. I mean, I've mentioned Netflix before. There's quite a few other examples as well. And just to reinforce that a little bit, with these graphs here, you can see here's in 2014 the share, the 9% share of that transport market from Uber, and the 52% share from taxis. The car rentals stayed primarily the same. But look at the share that Uber now has taken over in that short space of time. So there's some radical shifts going on. And what I'm suggesting to you is that those radical shifts are evident in the way that your concerns are here about being in the peripherate, about being sessional academics, casualisation and so on, and the difficulty that you're finding in gaining full-time employment. But I think there's something sitting underneath all of this in an ideological sense that you really need to be aware of. And I want to come back to age in just a second. Travis Kalanick's vision, as he calls it, sees Uber becoming a kind of global transportation service that will ultimately allow city dwellers to eschew owning a car. In fact, once we get to automation, etc., Uber hopes to be spread far further afield than it actually is. But Uber isn't the only company with ambitions of taking over the world. That's how they all think. Google and Facebook, Apple and Airbnb, and so on and so on. All the digital giants, along with a myriad smaller companies in their wake. Their goal is never a niche market, it's always the entire world. But far from being driven by delusional fantasies, their objectives are often realistic, made possible, and as I briefly had a quick look at before, by a potent cocktail unique in economic history, globalisation combined with digitalisation. So there's some unique factors at work that would account for your situation in some sense. But there's one that we don't often actually talk about. So those new masters of the universe, which they would love that particular title, they're fundamentally different, at least according to Schultz's argument, from their predecessors. Their primary focus isn't really on money. There's an ideology that sits behind what it is that they're trying to do. They aren't stumbling haphazardly into the future. Rather, they are ideologues with a clear agenda. Indeed, aside from their astounding success, it's that ideology that makes them unique. And that's really what I want to explore, what that thinking is behind a lot of this process. The message holds that technology can change humanity for the better. I was reading, talking about technology changing humanity for the better, on LinkedIn this morning, and there was another article that popped up on artificial intelligence. And maybe the headline of the article, it may be the worst mistake humanity has made. So what's sitting behind their thinking? There's a particular set of ideologies there that have a really odd mix of, you could say, libertarian ideas, but also countercultural ideas from the 1960s, which is where we get to age here. I probably wouldn't be amiss by saying I'm probably the oldest person in the room. I probably would suggest that most of you, let's just do a quick survey. How many people here were born before 1980? Before 1980? So how many years before 1980? You used to be Clive, I know what yours over there. Stay there. 3, 4, 5? 2? Okay. So what I want to suggest to you is that you've grown up in a world that has had a particular ideological, let's say political economy bent that has been in one particular thrust, in one particular area. Probably so much so that it's now quite naturalised for you in one way or another. I, at my age, grew up in a different world to that and saw the transition. And I was discussing, this is another motive for this as well, I was discussing this in a new class that we've got running called Creative Industries Entrepreneurship. And I had it wasn't an argument, but it was a fairly lengthy discussion about baby boomers, negative gearing, the ability of millennials to buy houses and so on, which we were talking about in terms of what our experience has been. When I first went to what was then called Teachers College, I was paid to go. I was given a scholarship to buy my books and so on. I was guaranteed a position at the end of that, so on. Completely different experience for most of you. But this particular student then railed against the baby boomers and myself and so on. And I went away after this discussion and started to think about it, and I thought to myself, well, that's a classic political tactic in as much as you shift the blame to another group over here and you stereotype them. But I think there's something more fundamental sitting underneath that. I came back to class the week after and I said, well, you know, I've lived through a system that was collectivist in some way, that was oriented towards the group, oriented towards the social, and then we completely shifted that and we shifted to a system that was oriented at the individual and competition between individuals and so on. So I've seen both of those systems at work in one way or another, and what I'm trying to suggest to you is that you've just seen the second one, and it seems to be that's the way the world is. What I want to suggest to you, particularly at the end, is I don't think the world has to be that particular way. However, when you have a look at the people that these people, like Kalanick, have been engaging with, they're an odd mix. Noam Chomsky, Ayn Rand, and particularly Friedrich von Hayek, which is that particular person I want to pursue right now, because I think this is where a lot of these ideas have actually come from. Here's Hayek here, and the more, this is a quote from him, the more the state plans, the more difficult planning becomes for the individual. And being a systems thinker and writing about the things that I do, what I see in that statement there is very simple, that sociological construct of structure versus agency. Your ability to make choice as individuals are those things that determine your action. And Hayek was railing against the state at this particular point and really emphasising these questions of individuality. And this is really what's been underpinning my particular research project, is looking at the basis of this It's not surprising that the phenomenological approach of Husserl was an important precursor to neoliberalism. Why is that the case? Because it tends to emphasise individual agency over that processes of collective action. So in other words, over the processes of deterministic structures. And Husserl argued that a human is essentially a free, self-determining being, and this state can be described as a form of, at least in Husserl's terms, rational subjectivity. So there's one thrust to this line of thinking that we're really dealing with on a pragmatic level right now. The other thrust is this, is that a lot of these ideas have come from Austrian economists, Austrian philosophers and so on. And they've been through a situation like this, where a lot of those collectivist ideas, you can see in totalitarianism, you can see in fascism, you can see in communism, etc., left them with a world that looks like this. And growing up as children through this process, they simply did not want to repeat that. So all things collective were anathema to them in one way or another. Which gets us in history to the Cold War. And you can see there, if you have a look at the oppositions that are at play in the Cold War, the same things that are playing out right now. Obviously, the US versus the USSR, and what have we got embodied in those two flags? Capitalism versus communism. That then equates simply to free market processes to planned economies, which very easily, I don't think correctly, slips straight into democracy versus totalitarianism. And as soon as you move there, you're looking at these concepts of freedom versus state control, free will versus determinism, and of course in a sociological sense, agency versus structure. So for me, these are some of the fundamental ideas from where you could say that neoliberalism has come from. Let's not go backwards. If you really want to get into understanding what's been occurring, I think this book is really quite good, A Brief History of Neoliberalism by David Harvey. Of course, you would recognise David Harvey as having a particular left-leaning bent, as a particular scholar, so you need to read these things with a grain of salt, at least a little bit. But he's still quite revealing. And I think this is fundamental to it. The founding figures of neoliberal thought took political ideals of human dignity and individual freedom as fundamental, as the central values of civilization. These all seem very admirable. In so doing, they chose wisely, for these are indeed compelling and seductive ideals. Very hard to not want them. These values they held were threatened not only by fascism, dictatorship and communism, but by all forms of state intervention that substituted collective judgments for those of individuals free to choose. Concepts of dignity, individual freedom are powerful and appealing in their own right. And these ideals appeal to anyone who values the ability to make decisions for themselves. The problem is, of course, just as Marxism ran into people like Stalin, Mao Zedong and so on, the ideals, when they meet the pragmatics of their application, become quite problematic. And I think you can find the same thing when you trace from von Hayek through to Friedman, through to Thatcher, Reagan and so on through, at least in this form, to David Cameron, who we apparently no longer have to deal with in any major way since we've left him behind. So there's a tension for both what has occurred in Marxism, but certainly has occurred in neoliberalism, this way that is pervading the world that you exist in, between the ideals of its theory and the pragmatics of its political and economic application. So, Harvey writes that neoliberalisation can be seen as a utopian project to realise a theoretical design for the reorganisation of international capitalism, built around the notion of freedom, or as a political project to re-establish the conditions for capital accumulation and to restore the power of economic elites. And it seems to be the pragmatics that in this process has actually won out in either of those two projects. So just to give you a bit more of a background in here, and I really do want to emphasise the idea of structure and agency in this process. So the adherents of the Austrian school of neoliberalism, and certainly the members of the Mont Pelerin Society, just Google if you want Mont Pelerin Society, they're still quite active and so on. Annual conferences around the world, I'll get to one of those in a second. What they were trying to do was displace the ideas of Adam Smith, and I'm come back to him in a second, David Ricardo, and most notably Karl Marx. You can actually track this particular historical graph from Smith here through to Malthus And you know, in terms of population and so on, so we're talking about evolutionary processes being embedded in their ideas here, right through to Friedman in this track. But you can also come from Smith through Ricardo into Marx and Engels and so on, through in here to Mandel and so on. The person that Friedman was mainly reacting to, however, here was Milton Keynes. Very significant in that period that I was talking about, just before you were born, and certainly after the Second World War, the Bretton Woods Agreement and so on. So there's something going on in here between those structure-oriented ideas in politics and economy, and certainly the agent-centred ones up there as well. And Keynes, in some ways, trying to move a middle path between them. So, neoliberals take a little bit, and this is where the problems start to occur. They take a little bit of Smith, in as much as they really like the idea of the invisible hand of the market being at work, but they leave the rest of his ethics alone. They certainly don't like the idea of the New Deal from Roosevelt's time. They certainly don't like the 5-year plans, 3-year plans from planned economies from communist governments and so on. What are they against? Well, Milton and Rose Friedman, and Rose seems to drop out of this picture very quickly, by the way. In their book, Free to Choose in the 1980s, he said all movements of the past 2 decades, across the 70s and across the 60s, were primarily anti-growth in one way or another. And they listed the consumer movement, the ecology movement, the back to the land movement, the hippie movement, the organic food movement, some of which are still existing, the protect the wilderness movement, the zero population growth movement, the small is beautiful movement. We're talking about slow professors this morning. The anti-nuclear movement, they all have one thing in common, according to Milton and Rose Friedman. They've all been anti-growth. They've been opposed to new developments, to industrial innovation, which is where I come in, to the increased use of natural resources, and so on. And they also believed that the forces for rights had gone too far, and that really needed to be addressed. So there's a fairly right-wing conservative agenda at work underneath these particular ideologies. And you've got to just have a look at the people that they've been advising and the people that they've been hanging around with and so on. One of Milton Friedman's colleagues was just here about 2 or 3 months ago talking to Scott Morrison from Chicago University. What's the application of these particular ideas? Well, you can see here the basic assumption that individual freedoms are guaranteed by freedom of the market and of trade, and that's the cardinal feature of neoliberal thinking. As I said to you before, there's a simple conflation between the idea of free will, freedom, and the free market. Those essentially are the same things. Of course they're not, but the assumption that all of this is based on is that fundamental idea. So here's a list of things that would then naturally fall from this, and you'll probably recognise quite a lot of them. All industries should be privatised, including education, and I've highlighted this one because that's the process that we're going through, certainly in this last 6 months to 12 months. Public services, the media, hence the ABC, manufacturing, transportation, finance, construction, the military, etc. All markets should be deregulated, and before you start thinking that this is just a Liberal Party problem, most of this was brought in by Bill Hayden in the early 70s, taken up big time by Hawke and Keating and so on. There should be no trade barriers, no tariffs, no subsidies, and especially no barriers to foreign ownership. A flat tax system is the best, as it treats all equally. That's of course arguable. Labour markets should also be freed from it should be of institutional constraint. And this freeing of the labour market necessitates the abolition of the right to strike and the right to unionise. And this is also important because we were talking about this a little bit earlier. You might not have talked about it in those terms though. An entrepreneurial spirit is necessary in order to innovate and move forward in the capitalist system aimed at growth. So these ideas are not new to the political arena. They've been around for some time. In fact, the first government to take them up big time under Advice for Freedom was Pinochet in Chile. And we can see some of the effects of that. So these factors are both necessary, that's this list, and sufficient for the creation of wealth, and therefore the improved well-being of the population at large. And that, in many ways, is a summary or a summation of what you would call trickle-down economics. So what I want to get across to you there are some slippages in ideas. There are some cherry-picking of ideas occurring here as well in that pragmatic project of neoliberalism. Their ideas didn't seem to be working that well, especially with Keynes around and the introduction of the welfare state and the state intervention after World War II to help those economies recover that needed it and so on. But once that project, that intellectual project, which is what it was in Keynes's part, started to falter, started to stutter and so on, around the 1970s with the oil crisis and so on, but particularly when economies started to stagnate or what they called engage in stagflation. In other words, the zero growth that was going on for them. It's at that point that the neoliberals started to gain some traction, because while these particular set of ideas, the Keynesian ideas, started to slow down in their effect, we started to look for solutions to those problems that the West was particularly facing. And it's that point we started to pick Friedman's ideas in particular. So they rebuild in the 1970s after a period of crippling stagflation in the West, which is when the neoliberals discover and redefine the work of Joseph Schumpeter, and hence the concern with innovation and so on. But here, once again, Giersch, who was an eminent neoliberal economist in Germany and also president of the Mont Pelerin Society, declared the new age of Schumpeter to replace the age of Keynes. And Schumpeter is, of course, no friend of neoliberalism, but Giersch had to play an intellectual trick. He nominally adopted Schumpeter's concept of entrepreneurship and dynamism whilst divorcing it from Schumpeter's commitment to macroeconomic innovation. I'm going to come back to that in a second. Giersch's entrepreneur then is an average guy. He follows von Mises, who declared every person to be an entrepreneur if he or she carries responsibility. The sort of things that we are asking you to do. Who asked that question about being a freelance academic? Who was that? Yeah. So this is this description right here. In this way, every dependent employee is easily turned into a self-employed entrepreneur. You can even redefine an unemployed youth as an entrepreneur, alone and fully responsible for his own fate. And this is really what we're looking at. However, Schumpeter hadn't quite argued that. He starts out arguing for the agent-centred, individual-based understanding of entrepreneurship, but then moves into that macroeconomic innovation. And I'll just say to you that Schumpeter had argued that innovation and change comes from entrepreneurs, initially focusing on what he identified as wild-spirited individuals. So he buys the romanticism of the day that he's working, he buys the agent-centred stuff and so on. And Schumpeter eventually adjusts his thinking on the evidence, the more that he studies this whole process, to accommodate the idea that structural entities such as big business were possibly the major driver of innovation, having the necessary capital to do so. I'm going to come back to those two things in a second. The two views, one agent-centred and the other structure-centred, may be more complementary than either Schumpeter and his adherents first actually thought. And we can see some evidence certainly starting to occur now. This book is a really interesting book, Doing Capitalism in the Innovation Economy by William Janeway, who is a Cambridge academic but also a very successful venture capitalist. And he's arguing directly with empirical evidence to say that you really need not just that single individual as an entrepreneur, etc., but you need the state, you need capital, and so on. So the action of the state is absolutely necessary in order to come up with innovative practices and processes. Now that's directly in contravention of what the neoliberals are arguing. So he's saying that business innovation, speculative capital, and the action of the state are locked in a necessary and ongoing relationship, what he calls a three-player game. Now, if we then move to Mariana Mazzucato, who's a professor in economics of innovation at the Science Policy Research University at the University of Sussex, this little book, and it is a little book, called The Entrepreneurial State, Debunking Public versus Private Sector Myths, simply puts in place quite a lot of evidence to refute what Friedman's actually talking about. And this book is gaining quite a lot of traction. Certainly Mazzucato has. Just check out her website, which is just marianamazzucato.com, and you'll have a look at the sort of things that she's been engaged in. So, lots of evidence to bear to demonstrate that the private sector depends on the state to make bold, high-risk investments in innovative processes and technologies before private sector venture capitalists and entrepreneurs take steps to capitalise on what the state has provided for them. And I think Carlota Perez, who wrote the Ford in the book, says that she was correct when she says that debunking myths is never easy. And I've discovered that myself in my own work on creativity and innovation. To get past the myth of romanticism is really problematic. It's deeply entrenched in our ideas, deeply entrenched. Swimming against the tide requires determination, a serious commitment to the truth, and massive evidence. And I think those two things go hand in hand. We were talking a little earlier about how long it takes a journal article to come out, etc. And I think that has an impact in a slightly different way. It's academics not talking to the public, it's academics talking to other international experts and determining amongst themselves whether they're right or whether they're wrong, whether they're correct in their assumptions, whether their hypotheses are right, whether they got the data right. This is what this conference is actually doing. So it's about truth, it's about evidence. And unfortunately, the evidence doesn't really work in terms of what the neoliberal arguments are actually talking about. For instance, there's a classic story about Steve Jobs. It's a great free-spirited entrepreneur, and he tells that story himself, who manifests the ideals of the independent innovator. Mazzucato's devoted a whole chapter in her book to Steve Jobs and where the mobile phone comes from and so on. But the story that they had access to not only public funds, which helped them start their company, but they used the technologies that resulted from major government research programs, military initiatives, public procurement contracts, or that were developed by public research institutions like this one, all backed by state or federal dollars, is seldom built into that particular myth. So there's a larger process at work, a much more systemic process at work. And this is a graph of where the iPhone comes from in terms of the other research areas that have fed into it. This thing could simply not have happened without those particular... You can go to Mariana Mazzucato's website and grab this, which I did, off her site. And that's also in her book as well. And the chapter is really... This is a graph of what the chapter is actually speaking about. So yes, there is an involvement of an individual in this whole process, but there are also much larger structures at work, business structures, state structures, and so on, that the iPhone owes its inception to. So, is there a paradigm shift going on in terms of, just as there was a move away from these Keynesian ideas of the social and the collective being important, towards these neoliberal ideas of the individual, agent-centred ideas being paramount? I think there is. And when you start to find evidence from institutions like the International Monetary Fund on their website, and this article by 3 of their economists saying that neoliberalism may be oversold, it might just be possible that that paradigm shift is actually occurring. And they start off by talking about Milton Friedman and the economic miracle that was occurred in Chile in the early 80s and so on. But once again, supplying evidence that there are particular problems with this way of approaching the world. So they argue again that policymakers and institutions like the IMF that advise them must be guided not by faith, but by evidence of what has worked. And it appears that while some of the things have worked with neoliberalism, some other things haven't. And it's a system that's starting to, without over-egging the whole thing, starting to eat itself. So they present evidence to suggest that surges of foreign capital inflows increase the chance of a financial crisis, once you open your market to financial capital. And such inflows worsen inequality in a crisis. And they go on to say that inequality engendered by financial openness and austerity might itself undercut growth, the very thing that the neoliberal agenda is intent on boosting. And that's what these graphs are actually demonstrating. There's now strong evidence that inequality can significantly lower both the level and the durability of growth. So rather than the neoliberal project leading to the ideals of freedom and equality for all, it's actually moved in the other direction. And there are things inside its whole process that actually are eating away at it as well. And just to give you some idea of how deeply embedded these ideologies are in the decision makers and the policy, etc., that we're talking about, just look at these words that were spoken at the end of the Saturday night. We live in times of rapid economic change, of enormous opportunity, of enormous challenges, a time when we need to be innovative, when we need to be competitive, and so on. And then Malcolm Turnbull goes on, and then says, the values of our party are the values of freedom, of business, of enterprise, and entrepreneurship. And if I was doing a discourse analysis on that particular speech, I would see underneath those particular words and ideas the whole neoliberal project at work right there. So, just to conclude, I think that's right on 40 minutes. what I want to say to you is I think your situation is as a result of those large structural processes being in place. There are other ways that we can deal with the world. How do I know this? Because I've lived through some of those other ways. I know that it's possible not to focus just on yourselves, on your competition, and the resulting process of that in terms of sessional work, casualisation, and so on, etc. 80% of us are employed as casuals, 20% of us are employed as full-time. Those numbers can change. So, understanding those deeper ideas, where they came from and why, is an absolute necessity in understanding how the processes associated with globalisation, digitisation, and certainly neoliberalism have brought us to our current state. This is why the fifth estate matters. And this is where you, as a particular choice-making agent, can do some things about this. You need to continue to investigate, question, argue for, and implement the alternatives. This is exactly what you're doing with your PhD research. These are the processes that you've embedded. These are the larger sets of skills, etc., that you've actually acquired in doing your research. You've become researchers. As networked individuals, you have access to alternative sources of information, people and other resources. And the fifth estate, to come back to William Dutton, enables you to move across, undermine and go beyond the boundaries of existing institutions, thereby opening up new ways of increasing the accountability of politicians, press, experts and other loci of power and influence. Right here. So as Bob the builder would say, and another politician of some note is just about to retire, yes we can. Okay.